strange and divine. I can sing, all is mine, yet not I, but through Christ in me. The night is dark, but I am not forsaken, for by my side the Savior, he will stay. I labor on in weakness and rejoicing, for in my need his power is displayed. To this I hold, my shepherd will defend me. Through the deepest valley he will lead. Oh, the night has been won, and I shall overcome, yet not I, but through Christ in me. No fate I dread, I know I am forgiven. The future sure, the price it has been paid. For Jesus bled and suffered for my pardon, and he was raised to overthrow the grave. To this I hold, my sin has been defeated. Jesus now and ever is my plea. Oh, the chains are released, I can sing, I am free, yet not I, but through Christ in me. With every breath, I long to follow Jesus, for he has said that he will bring me home. And day by day, I know he will renew me, until I stand with joy before the throne. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus. All the glory evermore to him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. Yet not I, but through Christ in me. One thing I know that I
in the passage that we're going to be looking at this morning, Paul is writing to a group of people who lived just about 10 miles from the famous home of the Isthmian Games. We sometimes miss the fact that the guidance that he offers them in these 4 verses assumes that they really do understand something about these particular games. Paul's challenging them in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, not to merely join the race of faith, but to be serious about it and to run to win. Now, I know that there's likely a lot of sports fans out there probably watching this now. And I know you'd agree that there are fans and then there are super fans. My son Joshua and I used to go to a couple of Blue Bomber games every year, and he would always paint half his face blue when we would go to express his support for the team. I, on the other hand, would wear a Blue Bomber baseball cap. When we would go to a Manitoba Moose game, he had a pair of huge moose antlers that he would wear. And he would sometimes even put temporary tattoos of a moose on both of his cheeks. I, on the other hand, would wear my Manitoba Moose t-shirt, and that would be it. And the moral of this story is that there are fans, and then there are super fans, aren't there? You know, the Greeks had 2 great athletic events, the Olympic Games and the Isthmian Games. And the Isthmian Games were held in the city of Corinth every 2 years. Before you were allowed to compete, every participant in these games had to take an oath that they had been training for at least 10 months. And back in Paul's days, people were passionate about these games. As I mentioned earlier, the Corinthian believers that Paul was addressing in the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, well, they lived about 10 miles from the famous home of the Isthmian Games. So it was likely something that his audience was already very passionate about and very familiar with. The first Isthmian Games were held almost 600 years before Christ in 582 BC. And although the main events were always athletic competitions, they also included musical competitions, kind of like an American Idol or a Who's Got Talent, except without Simon Cowell. This huge festival was the Greek people's attempt to honor the Greek god Poseidon. It was always held in the spring of the 2nd and 4th years of each Olympiad. And it was always held at Poseidon's rural sanctuary in Corinth. The festival was open to all Greeks, but it seemed as if the Athenians were particularly passionate about it. Now, as many of you know, our AWANA Grand Prix is happening this afternoon, and if a particular car wins, do you know what the builder gets? Well, they get a trophy, right? Well, back in the Isthmian Games, the winners of these various sporting competitions weren't given a trophy or a medal. But, are you ready for this? They were given a wreath of celery. I'm not sure that our kids would get too excited about that this afternoon. But later on, they changed the celery wreath to a wreath that was made of pine leaves. And they started to call this prize the Isthmian pine. I think you'd agree that this is just slightly better than a wreath of celery. But besides those prizes, the victors would also be awarded with a statue of themselves and a small sum of cash. From 228 BC and onwards, it was decided after a lot of debate that they would allow the Romans to take part, and that would eventually change everything about the games. The athletes would compete in running races, wrestling, boxing, discus, javelin. They had a long jump competition. And what was considered by most to be the marquee event was the chariot races. But as I mentioned earlier, they also had a singing contest and a poetry reading contest. So you might be wondering, why the history lesson? Well, it's important to note that when Paul wrote these words, that these were the games that his audience would have been thinking about. These were the sporting events that they understood. And these were the comparisons that Paul would be using to help them understand something deeper about having a faith in Jesus. This is what Paul tells them in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. He says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified from the prize. Now, one of the reasons why we know that Paul is talking about the Isthmian Games here and not the Olympics is because of what we read in verse 24. Again, Paul says this. He says, Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Now, in the Olympics, the top three get a prize, no matter what event they're competing in. The prizes are consistent. The top athlete gets a gold medal, right? The second place gets a silver medal. And the third place gets a bronze medal. So unlike the Olympic Games, the Isthmian Games, only one person would be declared the winner from each competition. And only that winner would be awarded with a crown. There was no second place. There was no medal of participation. Having a personal best time really counted for nothing. And everyone who competed with the goal that they wanted to win. In a sense, Paul is telling these Christians that they need to treat their faith in Jesus with the same kind of determination as a runner. We're not in the race simply to participate. We enter the race with the intent that we are going to be victors, that we are going to win. In fact, Paul says this. He says, run in such a way as to get the prize. So obviously, Paul's not talking about a physical race here. He's not talking about a marathon or a 100-yard dash, but he's talking about our faith journey. In fact, again, he says in verse 25, everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. This word compete that's used in this passage is actually a very graphic word in the original Greek. It is the Greek word agatismi, and it's from that word that we get our English word agony. And it carries with it this idea of struggling or contending with an enemy. I also find it interesting that the Greek phrase in this verse that we translate as strict training actually means to exercise restraint or absence, especially from certain foods or alcohol. I think the point that Paul is trying to make here is that our strict training as a committed follower of Jesus and our discipline that we develop as a natural part of a growing faith. Well, that means that we need to say yes to certain things, but it also means that we need to say no to those things that could potentially knock us out of the race. And I love that Paul is comparing our eternal crown with this crown of celery. He's saying they're racing and competing for a crown that will not last. They're working out and training their bodies for an event that will come and then it will be over. They put all this work and focus and sacrifice and effort into preparing for something that, if they win and if they are victorious over those others that are competing, well, their prize will eventually wither and die. But, Paul says, that's not the reason why we compete. That's not the reason why we prepare. It's not the reason why we sacrifice. We compete for a crown very different, and our crown will last forever. We compete for an eternal reason. Because of that, we are motivated by something very different. I think that we often forget that, don't we? What gets us up in the morning should be different than everybody else. You know, what motivates us and drives us should be different than what motivates and drives everybody else. Paul uses two different word pictures in verse 26 that drive home this point. And again, the people would have known exactly what it was that Paul was talking about. Firstly, he talks about a runner that's focused on the finish line. Then he talks about a boxer who doesn't shy away from his opponent. He says, therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. He says, don't be like the runner who forgets that there's a finish line. And don't be like the boxer who is simply air boxing. He says a runner's goal is to cross the finish line, and the boxer's goal is to beat his opponent. Back then, boxing was absolutely the most brutal event in the Isthmian Games. The boxer would wrap his knuckles with these leather straps, and when the Romans eventually joined the games, they would wrap in that leather bits of iron or lead, sometimes even spikes or pieces of bone. And these boxing matches weren't anything like the kind of boxing that we think of today. No 12 3-minute rounds, no break to get some water and to chat with those in your corner. No one there to throw in the towel if you're getting brutalized. These matches would sometimes last up to 4 hours and would only be finished when one boxer would be unconscious or the other would raise their index finger, which was a sign of surrender. Yes, boxing was serious and it was brutal. And I love that Paul goes on to explain how this all relates to us and our faith journey. He says in verse 27, no, I strike a blow, or as some of your translations say, beat. I strike a blow to my body and make it a slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified from the prize. Now, the word beat is another interesting word in the Greek language that doesn't translate well in our English, because it can also be translated as the word buffet. And if you're like me, you start to think of a Chinese buffet and what it means to enjoy the all-you-can-eat chicken balls and teriyaki chicken. But I'm sure that that's not what Paul was talking about. The word beat literally means, in this context, to hit under the eye or to subdue or to beat until someone's black and blue. So what does that mean for us? Paul is talking about a very different kind of training here, where athletes spend years training and disciplining their bodies to compete. Paul says that he makes his body his slave. His body isn't going to tell him what to do. He's going to tell his body what it needs to do and then train so that he can be the best that he can be. His body might be telling him to go to the Chinese buffet, but he's going to tell his body to eat some fruits and vegetables in a spiritual sense. See, Paul had been called to preach the gospel. And he's saying here that knowing that this is what God has called him to do makes him want to train and work and sacrifice and discipline himself to do that. Knowing that this is what God has called him to do makes him want to choose a life that's focused on winning the race that the Lord has put in front of him. Makes me think about us. Not just us as adults, but also you, young adults, you high school students, and you middle school students, and you kids, and even you young kids that regularly come up to the front on Sunday mornings. Do you know what God is calling you to do? Do you know what he's asking you to do for him? Has he given you a gift, something that you are good at? And he's now asking you to use that gift to serve other people? Every week we have people in our church leading worship, and they are using their gifts. They were doing something that God has called them to do. We have people that work in our tech booth, and they are good at that. And they do that because God has given them a passion for it. God has given them the tools that they need to do it. And God has asked them to use that gift in serving other people. Paul's thing was preaching. And I wonder, what's your thing? How is God calling you to serve today? It's so interesting to me that Paul writes about running the race and boxing in another of his books as well. When he wrote the book of 2 Timothy, if you remember, he was imprisoned in Rome and he was waiting to be executed. And there are certain parts of that short letter that are very reflective, almost as if Paul was looking back on his life and how God had used him. And in this letter, he talks about the runner and he talks about the boxer again. And he says this in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 to 8. He writes, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing." And I love how one scholar paraphrased those verses. He said this. He said, "I have completed the good athletic games. I have finished the foot race. I have kept the pledge to compete honestly within the rules. What remains for me is to receive the crown which the judge has already set aside for me. It will be awarded to me by the Lord, the only just judge, on the day I will see him." And that's a perspective that I think we all need to hold on to. This passage is such a good reminder to us that we don't strive for a crown that's perishable. We train and sacrifice and discipline ourselves for a crown that will not wither and fade, that will be eternal. We do all that so that when our race is finished, we can say with Paul that I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only me, but also all who have longed for his appearing.